Welcome to the Dream Lantern. The Dream Lantern has found a story for you tonight. There is nothing you need to do right now. Nowhere you need pity. No decisions that cannot wait until morning. No worries that are heavy enough to carry into this quiet space. Just let your body become heavy. Let your shoulders drop. Let your hands rest exactly where they are. Let your breathing find its own slow rhythm without you having to help it. Tonight, we travel somewhere far from here, beyond the mountains that have no name on any map you have ever seen, beyond quiet seas that move so slowly they are almost still, to a place that exists somewhere between the waking world and the dreaming one, a kingdom called Aurelith. Close your eyes and let the story carry you there. A long time ago, far beyond the last mountain range, in the last wide sea, and the last road that any traveler had ever thought to follow, there existed a kingdom. Its name was Aurelith. It was not a kingdom known for war, not a kingdom known for conquest or armies or the heavy sound of iron against stone, not a kingdom that had ever felt the need to prove itself to anyone. Aurelith was known for something far rarer than any of those things. It was known for peace. Not the kind of peace that arrives after a long conflict has finally ended. Not the kind of peace that exists because people are simply too tired to continue fighting. Not peace as the absence of something difficult. The peace of Aurelith was something altogether different. It was natural. It was original. It was the kind of peace that had been there from the very beginning. Before anyone had thought to call it by any name at all, it existed in the air of that valley. The way a certain quality of light exists in certain places at certain times of day, not added by anyone, not maintained by any effort, simply present. Even the wind in Aurelith moved slowly, as if it had learned over very many centuries that there was no particular need to rush, that whatever needed to be carried from one part of the valley to another could, that nothing in this particular valley had ever required urgency. The streets of the kingdom were built from pale stone, a soft, almost luminous stone that had been quarried from the hills above the valley long before anyone could remember, worn smooth by countless years of gentle footsteps, not the hurried, purposeful footsteps of people with somewhere important to be. The slow, unhurried, completely unrushed footsteps of people who had understood somewhere very deep in their bones that time was not something to be outrun. The buildings of Aurelith were low and warm, rooted close to the earth, as if they had grown from the ground itself, rather than being placed upon it. Their walls were thick enough to hold the cold out in winter, thick enough to hold the heat out in summer, to create inside each building a temperature that remained exactly right throughout the year. Their windows were wide, designed to let in as much of the sky as possible, as much of the light, as much of the sound of birds and of the gentle unhurried wind. Gardens grew between the streets, not plotted in neat formal rows, not arranged with a particular kind of effort that says someone was trying very hard to make something look natural, but actually natural, allowed to grow the way gardens grow when no one is trying too hard to control them. Soft and full and slightly untamed, leaning gently toward whatever light was available, following their own quiet logic, their own unhurried sense of what they wanted to become. Nothing in this kingdom felt rushed, nothing felt broken, nothing felt as though it was missing something is separately needed. Nothing felt as if it was waiting for something better to begin. Aurelith felt complete, in a way that very few places in the world ever managed to feel, in a way that you could sense the moment you entered the valley, the quality in the air itself, a particular unhurried quality that settled over you as you arrived and made you feel almost immediately that whatever you had been carrying on the long road to this place, you were allowed to sit down now. You were allowed to simply be here. The oldest stories of Aurelith spoke of a shepherd who found the valley first, third man, walking a flock that was not entirely his own, across a high, cold, windswept pass in search of somewhere sheltered to wait out an early winter storm. He had not meant to find anything remarkable. He had simply followed a narrow gap between two grey stone ridges, hoping only for a place out of the wind. And on the other side of that narrow gap, he found the valley, green and gold, and softly lit by a warmth that did not seem to come from the sun. He stood for a long while at the edge of it, not quite believing what his eyes were telling him. And then he did the only thing that felt entirely natural. He sat down and let his tired legs rest, and let his tired flock graze on the soft valley grass, and let the particular quiet of that place settle over him the way it would settle over so many others in all the centuries that followed. He never left. Others came in time, following the same narrow, drawn by stories that traveled slowly from mouth to mouth, the way everything in that valley would always travel. And together they built the first Philistine walls, the first low, warm rooftops, the first quiet streets that would in time wear smooth beneath generations of unhurried feet. They named the kingdom Aurelith. No one could say exactly what the word meant, only that it felt right in the mouth, soft and warm, and slightly golden, the way the valley itself felt. There was a road that led into the valley from the eastern hills, old, winding, shaded in places by trees that had been growing there longer than anyone could say. And travelers who found the road, sometimes by chance and sometimes because someone long ago had whispered to them of a valley where the light seemed to fall differently, always described the same feeling, a loosening, somewhere in the chest, somewhere behind the eyes, as if a hand they had known was gripping them had finally begun to open. The people of Aurelith lived their lives with a quality of attention that most people in most other places had long since forgotten was possible. They noticed things, small things, quiet things, the kinds of things that most people walk past without seeing. They noticed the way the morning light changed color as it moved very slowly across the Philistine woods. First, a deep, warm orange at the earliest part of dawn, then a softer gold, then the clear, even light of full moon. They noticed the exact temperature of the air on the first day of the year that truly felt like autumn. Not just a cold day in late summer, but the real first day of a real change in the season. And something in the air was genuinely different, and the quality of light was genuinely lower, and you could smell something in the breeze that had not been there the week before. They noticed birds returned first in spring, which flowers bloomed before the others, what the clouds looked like in the particular hour just before rain arrived. They noticed each other. There were people who listened when someone spoke to them, not half listening the way that most people in most places listen, while already owning in the back of their minds what they plan to say next, but fully listening, completely present, giving their whole quiet attention to whoever was in front of them, as if that person and what they were saying was the only thing in the entire world that mattered in that moment. Because in Aurelith, this was not something the people there had to practice or remind themselves to do. It was simply the way things were. The peace of life in that valley made it natural. When nothing is rushing you, have time to be fully present for everything. When you are not always moving, next thing, you can actually experience the thing you are in right now. Children grew up in this atmosphere and absorbed it without realizing they were absorbing it. The way children absorb everything important about a place simply by living there, simply by breathing its air and walking its streets and watching the adults around them move through their days. They played without hurry. They asked questions and waited patiently for the full answer. They fell asleep easily at night because their days had been lived completely, without a kind of restless, unfinished energy that accumulates when life moves too fast, when there is always more to do than there is time to do it in. And you arrive at the end of each day feeling not rested, but simply paused, waiting for tomorrow to begin the same rushing all over again. In Aurelith, this did not happen. In Aurelith, people walk gently, not to sharp sounds, not to sudden alarms that pull you violently from sleep, but to the light changing gradually through their wide windows, to the quiet sounds of the world beginning its day, to the gentle smell of bread baking somewhere nearby, drifting through the warm morning air like a soft invitation. There was a baker in the western quarter of the kingdom named Aurelith. He had been baking bread in Aurelith for longer than most people could remember him doing anything else. His hands were broad and flawless and moved through the motions of kneading and folding and shaping with the kind of ease that only comes from doing something 10,000 times without ever once being rushed while doing it. He began before the sun rose, not because he had to, but because he liked the particular quiet of that hour, the way the ovens warmed slowly in the dark, the way the first light arrived through his low window exactly as the first loaves were ready to be turned. He never hurried the dough. He let it rise for exactly as long as it wanted to rise, not by the look, but by feel, by the soft, slow give of it beneath his palm. And so, every morning in every quarter of Aurelith, smell of Aurelith's bread and the bread of every other baker who had learned patience from watching him drifted gently through the streets, waking people more kindly than any bell or horn or shout ever could. They rose slowly. They moved through their mornings without pressure, without the feeling that they were already behind. Conversations over breakfast lasted as long as they needed to last. No one watched the time impatiently. No one needed to be anywhere before they were ready. In the market square, near the southern end of the kingdom, an old herbalist named Wena arranged her small clay jars each morning in the same unhurried order: lavender, chamomile, a soft, dried moss that grew only on the northern hills and was said to help the most restless of sleepers find their way gently into rest. Near her, a glass blower named Isolde shaped small household lanterns, the ordinary kind, meant for reading by or sitting on a windowsill for a guest to find their way home by. Her glass came out always slightly uneven, slightly imperfect, a small bubble of trapped air here, a faint curved ripple there. She had learned long ago how to fight the small imperfections out of the glass. They were, she said, simply the places where the glass had been breathing while it's cool, and breathing things she believed were rarely meant to be perfectly smooth. Her lanterns sold slowly, one here, one there, to whoever needed a small warm light for their own quiet evenings. She never called out to passers-by, never urged anyone to buy anything they had not already decided they needed. She simply sat in the soft morning light and waited for whoever needed her to arrive. And they always did, because in Aurelith, even commerce moved at the pace of a held breath, slow, unforced, exactly as long as it needed to be. And because of all this, they arrived at each day, fully rested, fully present, fully themselves, which is perhaps the rarest thing of all. In the late afternoons, children gathered along the widest palestone street near the eastern fountain to play a slow, quiet game involving smooth round stones in the long stretch of patient waiting for a turn. No one ever seemed to mind the waiting. They simply sat in the warm afternoon light and watched and talked quietly among themselves until it was their turn again. There was no prize for winning, no real way to lose, just the soft click of stone against stone, just the low murmur of children's voice, just the long golden light of another unhurried afternoon settling gently over the kingdom. The seasons in Aurelith moved the way everything else in that valley moved slowly, gently, without any hurry, to become the season that came next. In spring, the hills above the valley filled with small white flowers that no one had ever bothered to name. They simply called them the spring flowers because that was exactly and completely what they are. The air in spring smelled of new grass, of damp earth, of that particular sweetness that only exists in the weeks when the world is deciding to grow again. In summer, the valley grew warm, but never harsh. The thick stone walls of every building held the cool of morning inside them long into the afternoon. And in the evenings, when the heat finally began to soften, people gathered in their gardens and along the low stone walls that lined the streets to talk quietly. As the light turned gold and then rose, and then at last a deep and settling blue. In autumn, the hills turned amber and rust, and a deep burnished orange that seemed somehow to glow even without the sun directly upon it. The air grew crisp, cool in the mornings, warm by midday, cool again by evening. People wrapped soft woolen shawls around their shoulders and walked a little more slowly than even their usual unhurried pace, as if trying to hold on to each of these particular days for as long as possible. And in winter, snow fell softly over the pale stone walls, not the harsh, beating winter of colder lands, but a gentle winter, a winter that seemed to understand exactly how much snow a valley like this one needed and no more. Smoke rose from warm chimneys, candlelight glowed in windows, and inside, families gathered together, telling the old stories, the ones that had been told so many times that everyone already knew exactly how they ended and what anyway. Perhaps because of that, every evening in Aurelith something happened that had no complete explanation that anyone had ever been fully satisfied with. As the sun lowered itself very slowly behind the western mountains, lanterns would begin to appear along the streets of the kingdom, not lit by any visible hand, not hung by any person passing by, not carried from any warehouse or storage room. They simply appeared one by one, as if they had been there all along, waiting quietly in some invisible layer of the same air that everyone breathed, waiting for the particular quality of the evening light that told them it was done. And then they would rise slowly, without hurry, not pulled by any wind, not carried by any hand, but drifting upward as if the sky itself was gently drawing them in, as if the darkness above was not in pity, but welcoming us. The night sky had been waiting all day for its lanterns to come home. They floated on currents of air that seemed to know exactly where each lantern needed to go, moving in slow, graceful arcs, sometimes drifting close to one another, sometimes spreading far apart, creating above the kingdom a constantly shifting, constantly glowing, entirely unhurried constellation of warm golden light. By the time true darkness had fully settled over the valley, the sky above Aurelith would be filled with these lights, dozens of them, sometimes hundreds, and from a distance from the hills above the valley, or from the roads that led toward it from the outside world, the kingdom looked like a piece of the night sky had decided to come down and rest in the valley. The lanterns of Aurelith and the stars above it blended together at the edges until it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began, until the kingdom below and the sky above seemed to be part of the same continuous, softly glowing thing. The people of Aurelith never questioned this. They had grown up with the lanterns. Their parents had grown up with the lanterns. Their grandparents and great-grandparents and all the generations stretching back to a time that no one could quite remember had grown up with the lanterns. The rising lanterns were simply part of life, as natural as the slow wind, as expected as night following day, as unremarkable and as beautiful as worthy. At the very heart of Aurelith, the precise center of the kingdom, where all the pale stone roads eventually led, stood a building called the Crystal Hall. It was not a grand building, not an imposing one. It did not rise dramatically above the roof lines of the buildings around it. It did not announce itself with columns or towers, or any of the architectural gestures that buildings use when they want to say, "I am important." Instead, it stood quietly with the same understated quality that everything in Aurelith possessed. Pale stone walls, wide windows, a roof that curved very gently like the soft arc of a wheel. Inside the Crystal Hall was a single open room, high ceilinged, cool, full of a particular kind of stillness that felt different from the stillness outside. Deeper, somehow more intentional, as if the room itself was holding something careful. The floor of the crystal hall was made from the same hailstone as the streets outside, but polished smoother still by centuries of quiet feet, entering slowly and sitting and eventually leaving a little lighter than they had arrived. Along the curved walls, faint patterns had been carved so long ago that no one could say who had carved them or exactly what they meant. Soft, sweeping lines, like slow water, like drifting smoke, like the shape, perhaps, that breathing might take if breathing could be seen. Some said the carvings were simply decoration. Others said they were a record of the lantern's own slow breathing, traced by hands that had sat close enough and still enough for long enough to notice it. And in the center of that room, on a low, smooth stone pedestal, rested a lantern, like the floating lanterns that rose into the sky each evening. This one never moved. It had never moved in all the centuries since anyone in Aurelith could remember. The lantern had sat in exactly the same place, on exactly the same pedestal, in exactly the center of exactly that room. And it glowed, not with firelight, not with moonlight, not with any light that had a name in any language spoken in the world. Something else, a warm light, steady light, a light that did not flicker or change or vary with the weather or the season or the hour of the night. A light that simply was continuously, patiently, without effort and without end. The warmth of it could be felt before you could see it. The moment you stepped through the wide doorway of the crystal hall, before the lantern was even visible to your eyes, you could feel it, a warmth that was not quite the warmth of a fire, not quite the warmth of sunlight. Something, both of those things, and neither of them entirely. Something that settled over you like a very gentle hand, placed very carefully on your shoulder. People came to sit in the crystal hall regularly, not for any ceremony, not for any ritual or obligation or religious practice, but simply because sitting in that room, in the presence of that steady, unhurried light, made you feel in a way that was very difficult to put into words, that everything was going to be alright, that whatever you had been carrying would be set down for a while, that the world was larger and older and far more patient than whatever was currently worrying you, and that your worries in the presence of something that had been glowing steadily since before anyone could remember seemed to lose some of their weight, some of their urgency, some of their insistence that they needed to be solved right. There was an old woman who came to the crystal hall most evenings, named Mira. She had lived a long life in Aurelith, a quiet one, full of small, ordinary joys and small, ordinary sorrows, the way most lives are full of. She had buried a husband many years before, and a sister not long after, and she carried still a particular kind of ache that never barely is a person, no matter how gentle the valley around. But every evening she came and sat on the same low bench near the eastern window of the crystal and let the warmth of the lantern settle over her. She did not come to forget. She came because in that warmth her grief felt held, not solved, not erased, simply held. The way a heavy object feel lighter when someone else is you carry, even for a little while. And each evening she left the crystal hall a little more able to carry what she carried, which is perhaps all any of us can ask of a warm in a quiet room. On the evening that sleep first came to Aurelith, Mira was exactly where she always was, on her lobby, near the eastern window. She felt the lantern's warmth, deep in the way others had felt it that same evening, and she smiled very softly to herself, as if some old patient part of her had been expecting this for a long time. She closed her eyes gently in the warm light and did not open them again. Her face in sleep held none of the old ache she had carried for so many years, only a deep and settled and truly unburdened peace. Left the crystal hall feeling rested in a way that was different from the rest that comes from sleeping, different from the rest that comes from sitting quietly in a garden, feeling something closer to peace, a peace that comes from the absence of difficulty, but from something deeper than difficulty, something that difficulty could not reach. No one in Aurelith could say with certainty when the lantern in the crystal hall had first appeared. The oldest stories, the ones passed down through so many generations that their origins were impossible to trace, suggested that it had been there before the kingdom, before the first buildings, for the first Pilestone roads. For the first person had looked at the valley and decided that this was a place worth staying. These stories suggested that a lantern had already been there, glowing in the open air without any building to shelter it, without any pedestal to rest on, simply present in the valley, as if it had chosen this particular place and was simply waiting for the rest to arrive, and that the people who first settled in the valley had built the crystal hall around the lantern, not as a place to keep it, but as a home or something that had clearly already decided to stay. Other stories said the lantern had arrived on the same night the kingdom was formed, that it had appeared on the first evening that anyone slept in the valley, as if it had been waiting somewhere for people to come, and when they finally did, it had simply lit itself and settled into its permanent place. There was still one more story older and quieter than the others, that only the eldest people of Aurelith still told, that the lantern was not a thing that had arrived at all, but a thing that had always been part of the valley, the way a heartbeat is part of a person, not placed there, not given, simply always present, that the valley itself had a kind of quiet life of its own, and the lantern was simply part of that life that could be seen. No one could say which version was true. Perhaps neither was. Perhaps all of them were. But every version agreed on one thing. The lantern had always been there. And there was one belief that all the people of all the generations of Aurelith had shared, passed down quietly from parents to children, from grandparents to grandchildren, from the very oldest stories, the very newest. The lantern must never be allowed to go dark. No one could say exactly what would happen if it did. The oldest stories referred to this possibility only in careful, hushed terms, as if even naming what might happen was something to be done with great care. And so, the lantern was always cared for, always watched, always tended, always given the same quiet, daily attention that the people of Aurelith gave to everything that mattered to them. There was a keeper whose task it was an old man named Thomas. Each morning he swept the smooth stone floor of the crystal hall. Each evening he checked the wide windows to be sure they were open exactly to let the night air move gently through the room, without ever disturbing the lantern's steady. He had done this for so many years that his hands moved through the motions without his mind needing to direct them the way. Rosan's hands remember the shape of a beloved and familiar dog. He never asked why the lantern glowed. He never asked what it would mean if it stopped. He simply tended it faithfully, quietly, the way his mother had tended it for him, and her mother before that. It had never once gone dark, and life in the kingdom continued, season after season, year after year, in its quiet and unhurried, and entirely completely. For many, many generations, nothing in Aurelith changed. Children were born, they grew slowly, nourished by the particular quality of life, that gentle body, by the air that moved slowly, by the light that changed gradually, by the adults around them who moved without hurry, who listened with full attention, who never made the children feel that they were in anyone's way. They learned to notice things. They learned to listen. They learned to move through the world without urgency, without the feeling that they were always slightly behind. They grew into adults, worked calmly, who lived fully, slept well at night, because they had never learned to be otherwise, because the valley had held them gently from the very beginning, and had asked nothing of them except that they be present. They grew old slowly, peacefully, in the way that people grow old when they have not spent their lives fighting against time, when they have not been in a constant, exhausting argument with the pace at which things happen. They passed on what they knew to the children who came after them, and the lanterns continued to rise each evening, and the crystal hall continued to welcome anyone who needed to sit in the presence of something steady. And the streets continued to be pale and smooth and quiet, and the gardens continued to grow in their own unhurried way, and Aurelith continued, season after season, year after year, decade after decade, century after century, as if it had found a rhythm that needed no adjustment, as if the valley itself had decided long ago exactly what it wanted to be, and having decided had simply continued faithfully, without deviation, to be exactly that. But one autumn evening, something changed. It was not dramatic. It was not a kind of thing that anyone would have noticed immediately. Not the kind of thing that stops you in your tracks, that makes you turn and look and say something is different here. It was the subtlest possible kind of thing, the kind that you feel before you see, the kind that registers somewhere below conscious thought, in the part of you that is still very old, the part that was listening to the world long before you had words for what you were hearing. The lantern in the crystal hall glowed differently, not brighter, not dimmer, not in any way that could be measured or demonstrated or shown to anyone else, but differently. The warmth it gave off felt slightly deeper than it usually did. The steadiness of its light felt slightly more intentional. The way a person's breathing become more intentional when they are focusing on something very carefully, when they are paying the fullest possible attention. Old woman sweeping the stone floor that evening paused without knowing exactly why, and looked at the lantern for a long moment, and felt in a place he had no words for that something was beginning, not ending, beginning. He did not know what, he only knew that it felt entirely right, the way the first cool evening of autumn feels right. Even though summer is over, a few people who happened to be sitting in the crystal hall that particular evening felt it too, or felt something they could not have said with any precision what it was, only that there was a quality in the room that was not quite the same as it had been the evening before. Something very subtle, like the particular quality of air in the hour before rain, when the pressure is changing, when the world is preparing for something, and everything has become just slightly more still than usual. They left the hall that evening with a feeling they could not name, not worry, not fear, something much gentler than either of those things, something that felt almost like the feeling of standing at the very edge of sleep, and the waking world has grown soft around its edges, and sounds are becoming slightly less distinct, when your thoughts have begun to drift in directions you are not quite choosing, and the dreaming world is making itself gently known. That same evening, the child, sitting alone in the garden that grew beside the crystal hall, began to feel unusually calm. She was 9 years old, Her name was Sarah. She had dark, serious eyes and a habit of sitting very still in gardens with the adults around her, had always found both endearing and slightly puzzling. She was not tired. She had not been running or playing hard. She had simply come to the garden after the evening meal the way she often did, to sit in the particular quality of the evening light, to watch the last color fade slowly from the sky, to watch the first lanterns begin their unhurried nightly rise to the darkness above. But tonight, something in her became very still, not the ordinary pleasant stillness that she often felt in this garden. A different kind of stillness, deeper, the kind of stillness that doesn't feel like it comes from inside you. It feels like it has arrived from somewhere else and has simply settled over you. The way a very soft blanket settles over someone who is already most of the way asleep. Her breathing slowed on its own without her deciding to slow it. Simply found a new rhythm, slower, deeper, more regular than breathing usually is. Her eyes grew heavy, not in an uncomfortable way, but in the way that eyes grow heavy when you are fighting to stay awake, in a way that felt entirely natural, entirely right, inevitable, the way evening is inevitable after afternoon, the way night is inevitable after evening. She looked up, the lanterns drifting high above her, watched their warm light for a long, slow moment, and then, very gently, her eyes closed. She did not fall. She simply leaned very slowly sideways and lay down on the soft grass of the garden and was still, breathing slowly, evenly, peacefully, fast asleep. At first, no one in Aurelith understood what was happening. The child sleeping in the garden was simply asleep, and the sleep was a gentle and natural and entirely unremarkable thing in Aurelith. No one was alarmed. The parents carried her inside, tucked her carefully into her bed, and assumed she would wake in the morning. But the next morning, she did not wake. She continued to breathe. She lay in perfect peace, her face soft and still and completely at rest. But she did not open her eyes. She did not stir. She did not respond to the soft sounds of the morning beginning around her. She was asleep in a way that no one in Aurelith had encountered before. And then, as the morning continued, another person fell asleep. A man sitting at his workbench in the late morning, his hands resting in his lap, his eyes closing slowly and without warning. Not the struggling, heavy sleep of someone fighting exhaustion. Something much gentler than that. A clean sleep, an immediate sleep, complete sleep. The way you sleep into water that is exactly the right temperature, without resistance, without effort, without any moment of adjustment. And then another, a woman walking through the morning market who simply sat down on a low stone wall and leaned gently against the warm stone beside her and closed her eyes and did not open them again. It was old Finn, the baker, next, standing at his workbench in the middle of shaping a single ordinary loaf of bread. His hands stilled mid-motion, the dough left half-formed beneath his broad, flour-dusted palms. He did not fall. He simply lowered himself slowly to sit on the low stool beside his oven and rested his head gently against the warm stone wall and slept. The bread he had been shaping remained exactly as he had left, half a loaf and half a memory of what it was becoming now. Near the eastern fountain, a young musician named Aldrich, who had been playing a slow evening song on a small wooden flute, felt his fingers grow gentle and still with note. The last sound he made was not a full, but the very beginning of one. A soft breath of music that simply faded into silence as he lowered the flute from his lips and closed his eyes and lay down beside the fountain where the water continued to run softly over smooth stone, as if singing very quietly the rest of the song he had not finished. Near the northern gate, an elderly couple who had shared a small stone house and a small, well-tended garden for nearly 50 years were sitting as they always did in the cool of the evening on the low step outside their door. Her head resting on his shoulder, his hand resting over hers, mid-sentence in a conversation so old and so familiar between them that the words hardly mattered anymore, only the warmth of saying them together. Her eyes closed first, then a few slow breaths later, his, and they remained exactly as they were, leaning gently into each other, as if the sentence they had been sharing had simply become a long and comfortable silence. And then another through the rest of that day, and into the evening and through the night. Not in panic, not with distress, not with any visible sign of struggle or fear or resistance. Each one simply and very quietly stopped moving, stopped speaking, stopped the ordinary daily business of being awake and slept. Old Toman, the keeper of the crystal hall, was among the very last to close his eyes. He spent his final waking hours doing what he had always done. Tending the lantern, he swept the stone floor one final time. He checked the wide windows one final time. And then he sat on the low bench near the pedestal and watched the steady light for a long, unhurried while. He felt no fear, only a quiet, settling certainty that this, whatever it was simply the next part of something that had always been happening. Something far larger and far older than his own single life. And Toman closed his eyes and slept, leaving the lantern glowing steady and warm. In an empty hall for the first time in longer than anyone could remember. Within days, a quiet had spread across Aurelith that was different from its usual quiet. The kingdom had always been a quiet place, but this was a different kind of quiet. The usual quiet of Aurelith was the quiet of a place that is at rest, of a place that has found its rhythm, of a place that is full of life, moving at a pace too slow to make much noise. The new quiet was the quiet of a place that has become still, completely and deeply still. The way water is still at the bottom of every deep pit, where nothing moves, where even the light that reaches down from the surface above moves so slowly it is almost not moving at all. The streets of Aurelith were empty, or not empty, exactly, full of sleeping people. Sleeping wherever they had been when sleep had found them. In chairs, in doorways, on the smooth pale stone of the streets themselves, in the soft grass of the gardens, each one perfectly at rest, each one breathing slowly, evenly, without any sign of distress, without any sign that this sleep was anything other than the most natural and peaceful thing in the world. The fountains still run, their soft, continuous sound, the quiet rushing of water over smooth stone, continued through the silence, which made the silence feel feel even deeper by contrast. The lanterns still rose each evening, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing of all. The people who had somehow, in some way that no one had ever fully explained, called the lanterns into being each night were asleep. And yet, the lanterns continued, rising each evening as they always had, drifting through the night sky above the sleeping kingdom, glowing with their warm, unhurried light, as if the habit had become so deeply a part of the valley itself that it no longer needed anyone to initiate it, as if the wreath had been going for so long that it had become self-sustaining. The gardens continued to glow. The crystal hall continued to glow. Nature continued its own patient and hurried rhythms around the sleeping kingdom. The season changed, rainfall, the sun rose and set. Snow came in winter and melted in spring. Birds arrived and departed and arrived again, neither troubled by what had happened to the kingdom below, nor trying in any way to reverse it. As if what had happened to Aurelith was simply part of the larger patient story of that family, as if the kingdom had not ended, but had simply moved into a different kind of existence, a quieter one, a stiller one that required no waking to continue. Years passed, then decades, then a century, then two. The kingdom of Aurelith remained exactly as it had been on the night the last of its people fell asleep. This was perhaps the strangest things of all. Nothing decayed, nothing crumbled, nothing fall apart in the way that things fall apart when they are left without care for many years. The pale streets remained smooth in the whole. The buildings remained standing and warm. The gardens did not wither or go to ruin. They grew, if anything, fuller, more abundant, more themselves, perhaps, than they had ever been when human hands were shaping them. Grass grew slowly over some of the paths, but gently, a few inches over many decades, as if even the growth of grass in this place had learned to move at the pace of the valley. Vines scraped along some of the walls, but softly, in no hurry. Deer began in time to wander down from the northern hills, stepping carefully over the smooth stones of the empty streets, pausing to drink from the fountains that continued their soft, endless running, fading down for the night in the soft, overgrown grass of the gardens beside the sleeping people, as if they too sensed that nothing in this valley meant them any harm. Birds nested in the eaves of the low stone buildings, raised generations of their young in the quiet undisturbed corners of a kingdom that no longer needed those corners for anything else. Was real soft and green across the northern face of the world, where the light felt more gentle, where the air stayed a little cooler, and none of it felt like decay. It felt instead like a kind of second life, a quieter one, slower one, as if the valley having finished one long patient chapter of story had simply and gently begun another. The sleeping people of Aurelith lay exactly where they had been when sleep had found them. In gardens, in workshops, in market squares, in beds, in chairs beside windows, on the steps of the crystal hall, along the paved, smooth street, each one perfectly dressed, each one breathing, slowly, evenly, without struggle, without pain, without any sign that time was passing for them in the same way it was passing for the rest of the world. Their faces were peaceful, not the frozen peace of something that has stopped living, the soft peace of something that is still living, still breathing, still in its own deep way present, simply resting in the deepest, most complete rest imaginable, as if they were dreaming something very long and very beautiful, something so absorbing, so complete that there was simply no reason to stop, no reason to wait, not yet. Travelers sometimes passed near the edges of the valley in those long, silent centuries. They would come to the top of the hills above the valley and look down and see it glowing below them, soft and warm in the darkness, a valley full of light, even in the deepest part of night, even through mists, even through rain, even on the darkest, most moonless nights of the year. Most of them stopped when they saw it, not because they had been told to stop, not because there was any visible reason to stop, but because something in the sight of that glowing valley made stopping feel entirely natural, made continuing on feel unnecessary. At least for a little while, they stood at the edge and looked down and felt something they could not name, not quite wasting, not quite wrong, something in between, something brighter than either, a feeling that whatever was down there in that gently glowing valley was something important, something old, something that had been there for a very long time and will continue to be there for a very long time after they were born. There was one traveler in particular whose name has survived in the fragments of an old half-forgotten story. A quiet man named Kestrel, who had walked for many years from one place to another, never quite settling, never quite arriving, but anywhere that felt entirely like home. He came to the hills above Orleans on a cold, clear autumn night and saw the valley glowing below him and felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of something he had been carrying for so long. He had almost forgotten he was carrying it. He sat down at the edge of the hill, meaning only to rest for a moment. But the moment became an hour, and the hour became most of the night. He watched the lanterns rise from the sleeping streets below, drifting upward into the dark, glowing sky, and listened to the slow, deep, rhythmic quality in the air around the valley. A sound that was not quite a sound, a feeling that presented itself as something you could almost hear, like breathing. Not the breathing of one person, not even the breathing of many people, the breathing of something much larger than any person, as if the entire valley was inhaling and exhaling together slowly, in perfect unison, as if the valley itself was asleep and dreaming. This feeling made some travelers uneasy. They moved on quickly, not looking back, but Estrel felt something entirely different. He felt comforted by the slow breeze, by the soft light, by the particular quality of the air around the valley that felt like no other air he had ever breathed. He stayed at the edge of the hill that whole night and through the following day. And when evening came again and the lanterns began their slow and patient rise, he found that he did not wish to leave. Not yet. He stayed 3 nights in total, sleeping lightly at the edge of the hill, waking each time to the same soft glowing valley below him, the same slow breathing in the air. And on the morning he finally continued on his way, he carried something with him that he had not arrived with, a feeling of unusual calm, a sense that the world was larger and older and more patient than his particular worries were willing to admit. Feeling that stayed with him for days, for the rest of his life, if the old fragments of the story are to be believed. He never returned to Aurelith, perhaps because he understood somewhere quite in himself that he did not need to, that he had already taken what the valley had to give in the distant kingdoms beyond the mountain that had no name. The story of a glowing valley spread slowly, the way all stories from the particular valley seemed to spread unhurried, passed quietly from one traveler to another over many years. Few ambitious rulers in those distant, restless lands cared of Aurelith and its endless patient light and scent, hoping perhaps for the secret of a life that never dimmed, or the secret of a peace that never broke. But Every expedition that came close enough to feel the valley's particular quiet found that its urgency simply and gently solved somewhere along that final narrow road. Soldiers who had marched with great purpose found themselves walking more slowly than sitting to rest beside the road and simply remaining there for a while, watching the light change on the hills, feeling no particular need to continue. Most of them eventually turned back, not because they were stopped. No wall and no army ever guarded that valley, but because by the time they were close enough to see it glowing, they had quite gently forgotten why they had come with such urgency in the first place. And so, Orleans remained exactly as it had always been, unconquered, not because it could not be reached, but because reaching it required a kind of patience that conquest has never once been capable of. Other travelers over those long centuries felt something similar. They sat down at the edge of the hill and stayed for a while, longer perhaps than they had intended. And when they finally continued on their way, they carried something with them, a feeling of unusual calm, a sense that the world was larger and older and more patient than their particular worries were willing to admit, a feeling that stayed with them for days, sometimes for much longer than that. Generations after Kestrel had come and gone, another traveler found her way to that same hillside, a young woman named Ren, traveling alone for reasons she did not share with anyone she met. Along her route, she arrived at the edge of the valley near dusk and saw the same soft glow that so many before her had seen, and felt the same unnamed loosening in her chest. She did not know the old stories. She did not know of Kestrel or of Toman or of a child named Sarah who had fallen asleep in a garden so many centuries before. She only knew that something about the light felt like an answer to a question she had been carrying for a very long time without knowing how to ask. She sat at the edge of the hill until the deepest part of night, and when she finally lay down to rest on the soft grass, she did not sleep in her ordinary way. She slept deeply, completely, more completely than she had in longer than she could remember. And in the morning, she woke, feeling as though something had been tangled inside her for years, had been very gently and very patiently undone. She left a single small stone at the edge of the hill before she continued on her way, not as an offering to anything in particular, only as a small private way of saying thank you whatever that did not need to hear it, that she needed to say. And through all of it, through all those long, slow, silent centuries, the lantern in the crystal hall continued to glow, exactly as it always had, steady, patient, warm, its light reaching through the wide windows of the crystal hall, touching the pale stone of the streets outside, falling softly on the sleeping people of Aurelith, the way moonlight hits quietly, without disturbing, without demanding, without asking anything of anyone, simply present, simply offering its warmth to whoever happened to be there. Either anyone was awake to receive the warmth, seemed to make no difference to the lantern. It did not glow for appreciation. It did not glow because anyone was watching. It glowed because glowing was simply what it did. Because some lights, the oldest lights, the ones that have been burning long enough to have become something more than light, do not need their reason. They simply continue, patient, steady, warm, while everything around them changes, while kingdoms rise and shake, while centuries move past like slow seasons, while the world outside continues its own restless hurrying. The lantern in the crystal hall changed, in the kingdom of Aurelith lies still beneath its endless gentle glow, untouched, unbroken, breathing slowly, dreaming something long and beautiful and complete, something that has not yet reached its end, and perhaps never will. And somewhere in that valley beneath the soft and hurried lanterns, young Sarah still sleeps in her small light room, her breathing slow, her face at peace, perhaps dreaming of the garden where it began, of the last color fading from the evening sky, of the lanterns rising gently into the dark, and perhaps somewhere in the soft, unmeasured place where her dream is happening, 300 years have passed like a single easy breath, in and out, slow and quiet. And if you listen very closely now in this quiet room of your own, you might notice that your own breathing has become slow, that your own eyes have grown heavy, that same easy, inevitable way that has nothing to do with effort and everything to do with simply don't. You do not need to fight. You do not need to hold on to it. Whatever you carry into this quiet room, tonight you are allowed to sit it down. Exactly the way the people of Aurelith once tears down gently, without ceremony, without needing to understand exactly why. You are allowed to let go, the way Sarah let go, the way the flame let go, the way Aldrich let go, the way an entire gentle kingdom once let go together, softly, without fear, do something deeper and warm and far more restful than waking ever could be. Somewhere far from here, beyond mountains that have no name, beyond white seas that move so slowly they are almost still. The lantern is still glowing, steady, patient, warm, waiting for no one in particular, simply present, simply offering its warmth to whoever happens to be there. And you are there, resting in slumber, held by sinking gently into a sleep as complete and as peaceful as any that valley had ever known. The lantern will be waiting for you tomorrow night. Sleep well.